lengthy title, but really just kind of looking at some of the trends that we've seen really come to a front, more so probably post-COVID, I guess, than anything else, whenever officially COVID ended. But just some of the things that are in our minds from a donor perspective, the shift in demographics, kind of the generational differences in the audiences and how we're approaching those conversations, not only one-to-one, but through our marketing and outreach, trust in nonprofits, or in all honesty, in society as a whole, and how that's playing a role in regards to communication and engagement with donors and ultimately stewardship. And then technology. Obviously, things are evolving at a pace that has never been seen when you think of AI and other tools that are good, better, and different, and here for the foreseeable future. And so, looking at touching on those topics today, and my goal with any talk and presentation is really just make sure you have a couple nuggets to take with you. Hopefully, be able to apply to your shop. I'm always a glasses half full person, so I kind of look for the silver lining in some of these changes and the uncertainty and doubt and everything that's been cast upon us the last couple of years. But again, hopefully more than anything, just give us an idea, or hopefully have a conversation around some things that are happening. First and foremost, I'm not going to belabor this, but it's finally here. The wealth transfer that I think we've all been talking about for 20 plus years. I remember in 2009 being on Boston College's campus, listening to Paul Skirvish talk about the big initial study they did, and how this was going to be changing philanthropy. And no doubt it's impacted philanthropy, but we're really at that point. And this is from Chronicle Philanthropy this past year. Just talking about what perhaps this could look like over the next 10, 15, 20 years as an impact to our industry. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and we've already been having a lot of success. This slide's dated a bit. It's 5 years old, but I kept it for a reason. This was one of the last times I heard Bob Sharp Jr. from the Sharp Group speak. If you ever had a chance to hear him speak, just such a brilliant individual. But he shared this as a keynote presentation at a Plan Giving conference in Philadelphia in the fall of 21 before his untimely passing in early 22. But he was really making the point, and I think it's a good one to remind us of, is for all the success we've had in Plan Giving to date, it's been in the kind of this baby bust. We haven't really started to see this true transfer as the baby boomer generation matures. And so we are really it's an exciting time in Plan Giving. Again, I was on the national board for 5 years, recently rolled off that. And we think about this as it relates to the nonprofits we serve. We think about it as it relates to the evolution of our membership, not only providing expertise and guidance to the Plan Giving community, but major gifts officers, generalists, because there really is a lot of opportunity in front of us over the coming years in the Plan Giving space. But part of this is, we're in a time that's never been seen before. There's a lot of opportunity as it relates to the transfer of wealth. There's a lot of opportunity as it relates to asset-based giving, but there's a ton of uncertainty. And there's a ton of, I think, probably in my 50 years, I just turned 50 this past month. This is the most divisive I think our society's ever been. You don't know what to believe. I try to stay off social media because I don't know what's AI. I don't know what's real. I don't know what's not. And so it's just a tough time for us. And while that's not necessarily something that's a charity thing or a nonprofit thing, it does impact us. Because people are navigating it in their day-to-day lives, and it erodes consumer and ultimately even donor confidence. And then it's all turbocharged by this thing called AI. I think coming out of the Super Bowl, there was commercials that are all AI created. There's, I think, apparently movies now that are coming out. It is everywhere in our society. And if you haven't heard Nathan Chappelle or Cherian Koshi, Cherian's actually local here in Des Moines, speak. They've been on the national circuit for the last couple of years talking about this. There's a lot of good things that are coming out of AI, but there's also things, especially as nonprofits, that we need to be mindful of, because once you lose donor trust, it's really hard to get back. And AI can very quickly erode that too. So this is really kind of the three buckets where I'll hopefully spend majority of our time today, just kind of looking at some of these generational shifts. Really, the space of Plan Giving, I've been in this now 26 years. The space that we've been and had a lot of success has been on the backs of the silent generation largely. And now as leading and lagging boomers, Gen X, and everybody else behind them are making their plans, taking care of their families, and hopefully leaving something to us. The decision-making process is changing, and the way they look at things is changing. We'll look at trust and transparency. Again, just kind of a reminder on some of the things that were headwinds, I guess, that we're navigating. And then I like to share examples. I pulled some examples of what people are doing to navigate that, things that they're sharing within their constituencies or within their marketing. And then again, a variety of things from a role on technology. This is really more not a, we're not going to solve anything with this last part on technology, but sharing kind of a little bit about what we're seeing. And maybe give you a little food for thought as you try to figure out what are the best ways to navigate that with your audience. So we'll start kind of on this key motivators of the boomers, because this really is an evolution of a changing landscape. Really, this is this is the leading and lagging boomers have a lot of similarities. For all intents and purposes, this is the group born between 46 and 64. Some are in retirement, some aren't. Retirement looks different than it did for the silent generation. But ultimately, this is an audience that we need to be mindful of because of this change in wealth. And I like to share this, and I've shared this in some other presentations too, because I think it drives home the point of kind of the differences, things that conversations we've been having for those of us that have been in the space for a while, with the silent generation in particular, they grew up thinking differently in regards to charity. They saw the impact big charity had and not gave blindly per se, but maybe gave more out of duty or gave out of this is my, I'm expected to do this. But things have changed a lot. And so, if you think about even, the baby boomer generation in front of us, the average life expectancy when the boomers were first born, when the first boomer was born was 63. Today it's 79. Obviously, this is a generation that's had and received more benefits from, the economy, the real estate, a little bit of everything. But also, now we're at a point where everything costs a little bit more. A cost to raise a child to 18 in the U.S. now is $332,000. And so, knowing that I have 5 teenagers in my house, I'm feeling this very firsthand right now. So again, there's just a lot of changes in this, and it's important to be mindful of that. And so I kind of bring this up because, the boomers are here, leading and lagging boomers, but they're thinking about things differently. The increased life expectancy, as I mentioned, in just 4 years, all boomers will be 65 plus, which means 1 in 5 Americans will be retirement age, or if that is still the retirement age. And so that changes how they plan, how they think about their philanthropy, how they think about their financial situation. This is an audience, with high levels of education. Obviously, this is expansive working experience. And the first audience really with dual income households. And you see here, I won't belabor these points on the side again, because I'll send these out to you. But they are a big part of our charitable audience, as I think probably everybody on this phone knows, or this call knows. That last point there is something to keep in mind, though, because they're going to maintain this wealth and equity for at least the next 10 plus years. This isn't like my grandfather who started our firm back in 1946, where, when he retired, he moved to Florida and that was it. He kind of moved into the sunset. This is one where people are recreating themselves in retirement and going to maintain and build upon those assets as they continue to enjoy those years. So we kind of I like to break down the boomer audiences into two groups, kind of the leading boomers. This is what we could refer to internally here as legacy leaders. These are the folks that, grew up in the wake of World War II during a time of really that global dominance, tend to have really a strong sense of responsibility, patriotism, very motivated and values-based. They saw a lot of social change coming out of age during civil rights movement. I remember my father talking about when he was at University of Iowa, he'd be on the ROTC and then coming back and changing out and going to protests. So I mean, obviously, a lot of things that have impacted them. And this was an audience that grew up with traditional media too. I think somebody's got their audio on there. Oops. No, we good? Okay. But a very family-focused, legacy-oriented group. And so when we think about this from a behavior standpoint, I'll just bring these up quickly. They are really mindful about doing right for future generations. And we think about that when we think of our messaging. They want to challenge the status quo. They're going to ask questions. Like every generation, since asking more and more questions because of, maybe uncertainties with life expectancy, with financials, obviously coming out of COVID, looking for security in some of those decision making. So how do we address that? They still do, and we see this because we work in all the different mediums as a marketing company, prefer direct mail and in person. I've long said, as a marketing company, if every nonprofit could staff accordingly to have enough gift officers, we wouldn't need to do marketing. But we unfortunately will never be the case. So, how do we use some of these channels to create that one-to-one engagement? And then how do we, through that marketing, try to identify what their values are and show them that we're a good values match. Now the lagging boomers, there are some similar tendencies, behaviors, characteristics. This is really what we call the informed investors. In fact, an example of this from just a couple of years ago was with the Mayo Clinic, who's one of our clients, and they had somebody reach out to them that literally said, "I have done my research on the major cancer centers in the United States, and you are the best investment for my donor dollar." And so this is an audience that, well, like a lot of us, they're questioning, but they're looking at their philanthropy, especially in this type of asset-based philanthropy, as an investment, as opposed to a duty. I mean, it still is a legacy, but they definitely want to make sure that we're going to be good stewards of those dollars and use them the way that we said we would. Audience that is much more adapted to technology. In fact, if you think about the users of iPads or tablets, the top users are folks in this age group as well as children. It's the easiest thing to use, easiest thing to check the email, easiest thing to check news and weather. So again, when you're thinking of your marketing, making sure that everything is easy to read and navigate through those channels. And they'll be loyal, but they'll be very demanding. And you may have already seen, no doubt, in your one-on-one conversations with some of these folks, again, some of those demands or some of those questions they may have. So when we think about it from behavior standpoint, and when we think about it from marketing and communication, they'll trust us, but we need to verify. So it's that balance of facts and feelings. How do we navigate that and support, the show them the data? The hard part about playing gifts that we all know is people aren't going to be around to see the good work the dollars do. So how do we reinforce that we're a good investment? How do we reinforce that they can trust us? Decisions are more deliberate. They may take a while to get there, but how do we think about that? And I'll talk to a little bit about what we think about with the donor journey and the different phases of the plan giving donor journey. And then they'll do thorough research. And we saw this a lot during COVID. You saw in May of 2020 and in September of 2020, the term update or make a will in Google Trends, the highest it's ever been. People were doing their own due diligence and people were kicking the proverbial tires in regards to what they should or shouldn't do with their planning when we were faced at that particular time. So there's some common themes as we think about this, obviously healthy skepticism, financially cautious. They expect clarity and connection. And I think connection, that's an important word because it maybe looks a little different now than maybe it did pre-COVID. It's not as much the formality of getting the lapel pin for being in the Legacy Society. Yes, events are important, and yes, we want to honor and thank people, but it's more about the one-to-one connection and maybe even breaking down some of the formal barriers. I mean, I love that we are able to do this and see into everybody's homes or offices. That wasn't always the case. And so, how do we continue to be transparent, authentic in our donor engagement? How do we show where dollars go? I mentioned that story from Mayo on being a good investment. How do we connect the dots for folks that, we are a good investment for their donor dollars? And then we'll talk a little bit, obviously, hopefully everybody's heard a little bit over the years of Russell James research, but that emotional resonance, how do we actually let them see themselves in our organization and so they can leave a legacy gift to honor perpetuity? But ultimately, I mean, the biggest challenge I think all of us have on this phone is just cutting through the clutter. No matter what research study you read, any one of us is seeing upwards of 1,000 marketing messages a day from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed. And so how do we as nonprofits, when we have a connection or when we have an opportunity to get in front of folks, how do we make the most of that? And it's really about quality of engagement versus the quantity of engagement. And I bring up that connection earlier, and I've shared this, and I'm just a big champion of Jen Shang, excuse me, and Adrian Sargent. If you haven't heard of them, they're brilliant individuals that spend a lot of time with the University of Indiana, the Lilly School of Philanthropy, but have created the institute. They're the founders of the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy out in the UK. And this idea of connection really came to a head early on in COVID when I read a paper that Russell James and now deceased consultant Michael Rosen co-wrote around plan giving. If you think about this back in May, March, May, April of 2020, people were thinking about their planning, people were scared, and they wrote an article called Plan Giving, the Best of Times, the Worst of Times, because people were thinking about this. But as fundraisers, we had to be really mindful about how we engage them because we didn't want to look opportunistic. And so they had been doing this study around donor connection that I stumbled on. It was mentioned in the party in the paper, and just really started following a lot of the work they're doing around how do you, in a two-dimensional world of marketing that we live, or even three-dimensional if you're using, video and other things, how do we show people that they're important to us? How do we bring the you into our conversations? And so Jen Shang is the first, professor of philanthropic psychology. She has amazing courses that even if you're not doing plan giving full time, have application for your annual giving outreach, have application for your major giving outreach. I sent a couple of our staff members through this years ago online, and it's an absolutely amazing course to kind of learn how to write with the donor in mind. In fact, randomly enough, even though they live in London, they vacation in Kansas City. And so we had the opportunity to bring her up and train our entire creative and strategy team a couple of years back. And so again, I bring her up because we've learned a lot in regards to philanthropic psychology and how you really, with this change and the skepticism or healthy skepticism that we're seeing from some donors, how do we break down some of those barriers using words and using images? And that's really, what she preaches. Your donor is at the core. And how do we make sure we empower them? How do we get them to see themselves in our missions? If they're a true values match for the work that we're doing, how do we do that? Hopefully, we're doing a good job one-to-one, but we always can't get that FaceTime. So how do we do that using some of the other channels and mediums? And so she does entire presentations on this. She's an academic, so I will tell you, they're not the most exciting presentations, but the content is awesome. In fact, I think there's probably a couple recorded webinars on our website at stelter.com that you can review if you're so inclined. But I wanted to touch base on just three of the concepts that she drives home. And so these are some of the questions we ask when we're thinking about incorporating what we call philanthropic psychology, into our writing. Connectedness. Does the donor see themselves as a vital part of your team? Do they feel engaged or part of your story? Does our messaging express them? Are we talking about how they will be joining others by making legacy commitment? Dr. Russell James talks a lot about social norms. People like me do things like this. Can we help them see themselves in our work? And I was having a call with a prospective client yesterday, and he was talking about he had just been on the job since January 20th at the school out in New Jersey, and said his predecessor was doing some marketing and was just all about what you need to do to help our school out. And it was nothing about the donor. And he's like, I want to flip that on its head. We need to talk about them. We need to talk about how important they are, and not what we need, but how important they are to our mission. And I said, I love that. You would absolutely enjoy the Phil Sykes stuff. Autonomy. How do we actually give people and ask these questions around, giving them the autonomy to make these decisions? A lot of our work, and I think a lot of us know this in plan giving, is creating awareness. People don't think about some of the creative ways they can support the missions that are near and dear to them. They think about what they can write a check for. They maybe think about, maybe leaving a beneficiary designation, but there's so many great ways for us. I was on a call with Queen's University in Belfast. We don't do stuff internationally, but they have a U.S. representation here in the States. And she was talking to how, some of the tools and mechanisms we have are so unique to our donor audience that they don't have those types of things in other parts of the world. So how do we, make sure they see that there are options that make sense for them? And then competency. Again, this goes to that trust, which we'll touch on in a little more in depth later. But really, how do we make sure they understand that we are we're going to be an organization that's around to do the good work with the dollars they trust us with? How do we reinforce our credibility? How do we continue to beat that drum? And I'm a big believer in repurposing content. And a lot of this stuff maybe already is in other areas of your organization or even on your website, but we don't always think of incorporating it into some of our plan giving outreach. So how do we take some of those things? And I'll show examples of how others have done that too. So here's a couple. I'm a visual learner, so I always like to use some visuals on kind of what we do. This is our client Care USA, and again, this is an appeal from a couple years ago. Nothing really wrong with that top one because we kind of touched on connectedness and identity, which is another uh, basic tenet of Phil Psych. But we expanded that to be a much more powerful message, saying thank you for being a vital partner and an unshakable commitment to the dignity of all people. Your thoughtful choice to support There's the Autonomy Care's mission is changing lives. So again, it's these simple things. I'm a firm believer, if you're going to apply anything like this, at the very least, use it in your cover letter and use it in your reply card, because those are the first thing people see and the last thing people see typically when they're thinking about connecting with you or opening your marketing piece. And here's an example of one of those reply cards for care. Again, revised it a little bit, nothing crazy, but you'll see the side by side there. Those check boxes are fine, but we also tweak that to say, I've already chosen to preserve my passion for helping people facing crisis. Again, making it resonate more with the mission and the reason they pay attention to you anyway. Here's a couple examples again on reiterating values. This is Boston Children's Hospital. They do a great job engaging boomers around this values guide, top reasons that they support us, important factors. This was actually them recapping a survey that they did. And so they're able to really kind of close the loop with folks after they submitted those surveys and thank them and then tell them, here's you. You're at the heart of the stories that we share and really bring it back to about the donor. National Resource Defense Council does a great thing. We think the world of you because of you. They constantly are driving that home in every single message they put out. Thank you for making the earth your air. Because again, it's really about the donor and the connection to their work. And then I've shared this one in a couple other talks, but I just think it's really great. Matthew Clark and his team out at West Virginia, this is an impact report. A lot of us do maybe variations of this, but really just talking about you. You see you highlighted on almost every single one of those pages there. What I really liked about this is because it was an engagement piece, it was a stewardship piece of sorts, is they didn't ask you to request a booklet. They didn't ask you for a donor or for a meeting with a development officer. That reply mechanism on the bottom left there is please share your words of encouragement to my fellow mountaineers. Again, they really were trying to engage on a more emotional level versus a transactional level. So again, that's just kind of a broad overview on some of the things we're seeing in the shift of demographics as we are talking more to donors that maybe have a little more healthy skepticism than previous donors. How do we use words? How do we use some of these ideas to engage with them? And that leads right into kind of coming out of the last couple of years, the importance of building trust and transparency with our donors. And this actually, I thought this was an interesting saying here. Public trust is the currency of the nonprofit sector. Independent sector does this study on trust in nonprofits and philanthropy, and this is kind of some of the high level highlights that I pulled out. Trust for nonprofits rebounded. So this is from 2024 to 57%, which was 5 points, I think, here give or take. But trust in philanthropy remains steady at 33%, which is lower than trust in nonprofits. So, what does that say about, do donors trust us to be good stewards? Do they trust us to use the dollars as we said we would? How good are we at closing the loop with them to show them the impact dollars have done? Or people like them, donors like you, do things like this. Have we done a good job using impact stories when we're engaging them? And then I use this as an interesting thing because this is very real with this ever-changing world we're in. The impact of uncertainty on trust, and came out originally a couple of years back. Rachel Botsman, who's a trust fellow at the University of Oxford, authored a book called "Who Can You Trust?" And I followed her blog for years through LinkedIn, or I think LinkedIn. And it was interesting because the last couple of years, a lot of us, whether it's us individually as fundraisers or our organizations, the reason people get engaged with us, they volunteer, they come to events, they give annually, is because of what they've seen us do. And that's our reputation. It's a very reflective measure. The hardest part of the last couple of years is because of all this uncertainty, because of knowing what to believe in the news media or in other channels. It's trying to turn that reputation into trust, which is more predictive, thinking down the road. I trust that they're going to do this. I trust that they're going to make good decisions. In fact, one of my old friends who's now retired, we had worked together on rolling out the national standards for gift planning success. Catherine Myrie, amazing consultant down in Birmingham, Alabama. She spoke about one of the ways that she tries to, and one of the ways she had worked with her clients to try to break, to support that idea of trust is anywhere if they had a strategic plan. And they, on their plan giving pages in particular, on their websites, she would always ask them, link your strategic plan, link your top 3 or 5 pillars, or whatever it may be, based on where you're going, because people want to know where you're going. If they're going to make a commitment like this, they want to have an idea of where your organization's going, because it is, as we spoke earlier, they see it as an investment. And there's just kind of another way to kind of think about that. Reputation is that perception, what people say. The trust is what people believe, and trustworthiness is how we behave. So how do we, I'd like to think all of us on this phone do a great job of that when we're face to face with donors or on the phone with donors. But how do we incorporate that in our outreach? Annual impact reports, financial transparency, consistent stewardship. Dr. Russell James talks about donor trust increases significantly when they can see how their gift will live on beyond their lifetime. So how do we share stories? I'm a big believer in donor stories. I like to use them, but I personally almost prefer to use impact stories. How is a past gift, an estate that's matured? How can we tell a story about how that's impacting programs today, how that's impacting children today, how that's impacting scholarships today? Because that makes it more tangible for folks. So again, here's some of those concepts in action. Again, try to utilize some of that social proof. World Wildlife does a great job of this year over year. Again, they incorporate a lot of surveys into their outreach, but they always follow up. You spoke, we listened. They want to share, hey, here's some of the things you shared with us. Here's actual quotes that donors said. And then, use that as a chance to steward folks and let them know, hey, we're making decisions based on what we hear from you. Again, here's CARE. I shared that earlier. They do a similar thing, but they use infographics as well to draw attention to some of those. I'm a big believer in that. If you can work with your Marcom teams, if you have different infographics on where the dollars go in your annual reports, where appropriate, incorporate those into your plan giving outreach, just to drive home that repetition of marketing, that we are good stewards, this is how we spend your dollars, put it on your website. But again, it's important to keep that top of mind for folks. And then Sierra Club as well, talking about again using examples from what they heard in their survey. Stronger together. Your insights, again, the insights they glean from the survey power our shared vision for the future. And then they did a great job on that one. Here are your top resources for supporting Sierra Club. Your input keeps our shared conservation goals moving forward. So again, trying to create what I like how some of these organizations have done this is they're using what is a very typically one-way communication line, direct mail, and they're turning it more of a two-way dialogue.
Board member, yeah.
Somebody have a question? Oh, no. Okay, sorry. That's just been a hot mic. So I bring all that up because as we think about trust and transparency, a lot of this ties into the donor mindsets. And these are things that our staff thinks out every day. And again, you don't need to write all these down. I'll provide this as a PDF. I've got my University of Iowa cup here. As a side note, I saw Bob King on here, who's a longtime friend. My oldest son, he's at Drake currently. He's a freshman at Drake. His middle name is Hawkeye. So I am trying to get him to transfer next year. So we'll see. Oh, there he is. There's Bob. I knew you were there. So anyway, so this is something that we think about day in, day out. And I think this is important for you or your staff as you're thinking about how you engage folks to be mindful too. And these are really, as we think of legacy donors, how do we get them to a place to make a decision? How do we show them that the problem is worth solving? Whatever the mission is that we have and the work that we're trying to do. How do we show them that we can do it, that we're the ones that can actually affect change? How do we show them or get that belief that our organization will be around? Obviously, that's huge when it comes to legacy gifts, that we'll spend your money wisely, that we'll be good stewards. And then how do we, show them the connection? How do we get them to see themselves within our work? Ultimately, number 5 is where we always are trying to play a big role here at Stelter is how do we get them to understand that an estate gift, it's not just the annual gift they give year over year, or not just the time that they're tithing, but it's how do we show them that an estate gift is a smart choice and it can make an impact. Again, I've brought up a couple times social norms and helping the donor develop identity. They are someone who gives. They are someone who does things like this. And then this is always the kind of coup de grace is, how do we get them to share? Yeah, we all know in different research studies you see for every one bequest notification you know of, there's typically two or three others out there. It's roughly two-thirds of people keep these intentions private. And so how do we continue to find ways to get them to raise their hand and share with us so we can be mindful of that with their planning? And so the next two slides are kind of a little bit of death by PowerPoint, but again, just for maybe more consumption later on. But this is really where we're trying to understand the journey with these mindsets. How are they important to you? How can they make a difference? What's their connection? And do they see themselves? Is it a values match? And it's fine if it's not. I mean, they may have that values match with another organization, but for those that are near and dear to you, how do we let them see themselves? And then this is kind of bringing both those things together. Again, this is that death by PowerPoint. You don't need to consume this all right now, but I'll talk through a couple of these things and give you examples of how others are doing this when we're thinking about the supporting phase, where people first come into contact with their organization, maybe as a volunteer, maybe attending an event, giving once. Um, if we pique their interest enough, they typically are in that discovering phase and want to learn a little bit more and maybe start hearing a little bit more consistently from us. We're starting to kind of plant the seeds around asset-based ideas or other ways to support. And considering tends to be the longest phase that a lot of these legacy donors will live in, because they are really kind of weighing. I remember in 08, 09 when I mentioned I've been on Boston College's campus, and that was an AFP Wealth and Philanthropy Summit when we were talking about the wealth transfer. They also were talking about, if you remember back in 08, 09 with the downturn in the housing market, how there was concerns that philanthropy was going to drop off. And in reality, it didn't drop off, but it changed a bit. And they had a couple folks from some family foundations up on that panel, and one person shared, going into this period of time, I was giving annually to 8 charities. I've had a chance to reflect, and now I'm giving to 3 or 4. And I think we saw a similar thing with COVID too. We saw, you may have seen people giving to more. And this is, again, a generational thing where we'll still see estates come across our desks with a dozen charities, but more and more, and Blackbaud's done studies on this too, more and more, especially in the boomer generation, are giving more to fewer. And so I bring that up because that's that consideration phase. How are we good stewards of their journey? How are we educating, informing? How are we staying connected to them as they're weighing their options? And then ultimately, decision and acting, getting them to that point of making the decision. And we have some success and some ideas on how we do that too. So I really want to spend time in 3 of those areas on kind of that donor mindset. If you remember those 7 mindsets I just shared, this was the one that was the third one. This organization is trustworthy. Again, how do we make sure that we are driving home that we are an organization that's going to be around for the long haul? That if they were to leave us in their will and that comes to fruition down the road, that we're going to be there and we'll be good stewards of that. And so this comes from actually the Giving USA Leaving a Legacy study, where they asked questions on those top factors outside of mission, but top factors in choosing an organization for their largest gift. And track record of success. And again, that goes to the reputation versus trust. And so, okay, we've got them to the table. They've seen what we've done. How do we give them peace of mind that we can continue to do that? That goes right to the next one. That's top of mind. Organization is going to be around for a long time. I see a lot of people celebrating, 50-year anniversaries, and how do you, how are we going to build on for the next 50 years? Trying to bring donors into the story for that. Oops. Firsthand knowledge. This is where we all come into play. We may be the ones with the relationship with the donor, but it may be somebody else on our staff too. And so, how do we make sure those folks are versed or aware to kind of listen for cues as well? And then the last couple were respecting leadership, again, knowing where there's a plan and that we're good stewards. And so that's a lot of things, but again, all makes sense. And so if you think about what these may look like in action, here's some examples. This first one is Miller Children's and Women's, where again, as I mentioned earlier, trying to connect the dots. Join us as we celebrate our next 50 years. Feeding America, I shared this earlier when we were talking about using stuff from your annual report. In every plan giving outreach they put together, they always remind people on why. What is the impact that we're having? This may not be specifically tied to the impact that plan gifts are having, but it's the impact of their mission and their work is having. And so how do they incorporate that? Same thing here. We see AmeriCare is kind of tying that in. on, where they're doing work and the impact that can be felt around the world. And although I'm an Iowa grad, I did share a Michigan State thing here, but your dedication makes a difference in Michigan and beyond. Again, constantly beating that drum on where dollars go and how we are good stewards, because again, the nature of most planned gifts, people won't be around to see the good work those dollars do. The next part of those seven mindsets is the connection. That's critical. How am I connected to this work? Because we know giving is ultimately emotional. When people give, they feel good. We all know that. You probably read about the emotional boost donors get from giving, that release of the feel-good chemicals, oxytocin, serotonin. But as fundraisers, we can help donors feel good by closing the loop between a donor's gift and the impact of that gift. So how do we, again, show them where, if they haven't already done a gift like this, how do you show them how others that have done that and the impact it has? And I've shared this before, and I always fall on the sword because it's an Iowa State example. But I love sharing real stories. And it's so much easier for a donor to see themselves in an individual story versus a story of all the students that you can have an impact on. And so, how do we, as schools tend to maybe have it a little easier by talking about scholarships or endowed scholarships, but bringing those to the forefront as frequently as we can, making sure that we're echoing that sentiment in regards to how this student is able to benefit because of what somebody else had the foresight to do. And again, there's the quote that I mentioned earlier from Dr. Russell James. Donor trust increases significantly when they can clearly see how their gift will live on beyond their lifetime. And then the final part of those seven mindsets that I just want to touch base on is really this idea of an estate gift as a smart choice. And this goes to, again, I quote a lot of Russell James. I just think he's such a terrific individual and shared so much with this industry. But this really goes to his work he's done around death transcendence and thinking about how we want to be remembered as well as how our life can make that impact. And I like to bring this up because I think it's important, but there's a development psychologist named Eric Erickson that theorized that humans go through these eight psychosocial developments. And so really for the world that we live, typically we focus on these last two, middle adulthood and maturity. Uh, Middle adulthood in particular, because this is us developing feelings of generativity in regards to thinking about the mark we wish to leave, the legacy, which ties obviously really well with the work that we do. People at this stage typically feel successful. They feel like they're actively contributing in their communities. And so we can connect with the donors at this stage by showing them how their gifts can benefit the communities, especially how they will help the next generation, which is really a natural fit for legacy giving. And then you think of the maturity, the ego integrity versus despair is that last stage of development when they begin to tackle, and this is again, we've seen iterations of this, especially how quickly it came to a front with COVID, people tackling their own mortality and triggered by life events typically. That could be retirement, that could be a global pandemic, that could be loss of a loved one. But people at this stage really are reflecting. And this is, specifically back on their life story, considering whether they lived a meaningful life, they feel successful, and they have very few regrets. And so that's that ego integrity versus despair. And when they feel they are leaving behind something that will last. A lot of times we see that in grandkids. We see that or in meaningful contributions elsewhere. I know you think of my father, who we were talking about earlier. He'll be on site tomorrow for a board meeting. He's 78. He spends a lot of his time working with children's organizations here in the Des Moines metro area because that's his passion, is seeing that for the future. Child Serve, Jacobs, Joshua Academy, and the like. So again, he's at that point where he's like, where do I see that my impact and my legacy can make a difference? And so here's just some simple examples that others have done. They just both happen to be arts organizations, but Carnegie Hall and Juilliard School, I think this is great. Some of the just taglines they use: keep the music alive for the next generation. Your dedication keeps the music playing. If you look at the Juilliard, you help protect the future of the arts. Your legacy can set stage for their success. And so thinking of your missions, are you doing that? Or how can you do that better? Are there ways to kind of help connect the dots when you're communicating with folks that may be at that point of their donor journey? Now, again, here's an example of wounded war, excuse me, World Wildlife. There's WWF, WWP. Your kindness helps communities flourish, and together we create a better world. Again, trying to show them where that journey is. For organizations that you can't go on campus, you can't go to the theater. They're trying to bring that idea to them, show them where they actually are having an impact. And again, here's a similar example too from International Rescue Committee. Again, your kindness in action, trying from history to legacy, the impact this individual's had on the organization and how the organization's impacted them to what they're trying to do for their legacy to live on. And then I always leave when I'm thinking of this at every stage of that donor journey is remembering it's about them. How do we thanking them time and time again in everything we do? And so, we all know, your best plan giving prospect is somebody who's already made a plan gift. If they made a simple percentage designation, we want to continue to thank them again. So again, hopefully I gave you a couple ideas in regards to maybe things you could already pull from at your organizations to further build upon your role in your donors' lives and the trust and the authenticity. Hopefully you're building or continue to build with them. But wouldn't be a presentation in 2026 if we didn't talk about the impact of technology and this 24/7 access to information that we have, and which really blew up and hasn't changed since COVID. Because I think, and I've shared this with others, I think, the streaming services, I don't remember if they were around before COVID. I really don't. I think I was a DirecTV household for like 25 years. And then now I think I don't even know. I need to get one of those apps that shows me how many streaming services I have. But we are in a time that has never been seen before where it's content consumption over and over again. And it is tough because you don't know what to believe. You don't know, what the right channels are because everybody's got, the echo chambers and the algorithms. So how do we navigate that? And how do we have our one-to-one communication, and that should be, a good trustworthy channel for us. We have our outreach, whether it's direct mail or email or our own websites, but we also have to go fishing where the fish are. So how do we use social media? How do we use some of these other tools to actually find folks? And so as we get into this section, I always like to remind people, most of us are familiar with what's on the left here, the donor pyramid. We go through our databases when we're trying to figure out, portfolios or marketing lists. And we're like, all right, who have been those folks that have been on file for a while? And we've been able to grow up the pyramid, to be consistent donors and maybe lead donors. And ultimately, the top of that pinnacle has always been bequests or the planned gift, which is still very much true. However, I do think because of social media, because of 24/7 access to information, donors, and depending on your mission, but donors can come in contact with your mission and your organization at different stages of that donor journey. It may not be somebody who's been on file and been an annual giver for 10, 12, 15, 20 years. In fact, and this is going back a ways now, but we did a study back in 2009 around the ladder of engagement. How does one person get to become a plan giving donor? And sure enough, as we kind of looked at, the folks who had made plan gifts in the study, 50, I think it was 59% were folks that had been on file or had given financially for 10 plus years. But of the remaining 41%, 20% had only been giving, they'd made a plan gift, but they'd only been financially contributing to the organization in the last 5 years. So something had happened. They'd gotten on the radar somehow, and within those 5 years had built a connection so deep that they wanted to leave a legacy. But even more interesting was the additional 20%. Those folks who made a plan gift had never financially contributed to the organization. And so I bring this up because it's very true that, we can, market to our lists, we can build our portfolios from the people that we know about, but inevitably there's probably others out there that have seen our work from afar. And so how do we engage them? In fact, there's been a variety of studies that have come out. This one was by Google and CEB a handful of years ago, talking about that people may be up to 60% of the way to a decision about their gift before they ever engage us. And so, as fundraisers, I think it's first and foremost, we have to be okay with that. We have to be able to meet donors where they're at. We can't, as much as we'd like, hold their hand throughout the whole journey. That journey I showed you earlier of discovering and creating plans. We have to be okay that they can pop in and out in different places. And one of my mentors was Jeff Comfort, who was at Georgetown for years. And he shared this, probably 10, 15 years ago, that we're no longer holders of the keys. We have to be okay with the fact that people don't have to come to us for request language. They can go to our website. People don't have to come to us for certain things. They can self-serve a little bit more. And that's where technology has really played a huge role. And part of what we're seeing from the nonprofit, from the donor side, is what are their expectations from how has technology changed the way they expect to be communicated with? And they really expect more personalization. In fact, when we look at boomers tend to be especially are responsive when communication feels custom and then respectful. So it doesn't feel forced, doesn't feel generic, doesn't feel, but it feels tailored. And so, part of that is giving them options on how they want to be communicated to. And I'll show some examples of what others are doing. I personally hated QR codes for the longest time. That was, again, when I talk about silver lining, something that maybe came out of COVID that I don't mind anymore. And it's actually been a good tool for us when we're talking and using print, and we still want to get people to a resource or to a tool or to an online gift calculator or to Giving Docs or a will platform or something like that. Using, where appropriate, you can direct folks to QR code because even my mother at age 78 uses QR codes. And so, how do we give them options using technology that's in front of us? I consistently think about video. And it doesn't have to be highly produced video to really have an impact. This is Easter Seals, Iowa, some things that we just whipped together for them just for some marketing that they were doing, not even plan giving related. But even, I've had conversations with some of my friends where an individual who serves at an arts organization in upstate New York. During the pandemic, she was getting inquiries from folks on, hey, we obviously can't be on site for all the reasons we were all sheltering in place for 2 weeks. But she said, I want to share video of the work that we're doing. But my marketing team wants me to have this all polished and it has to be their way. She goes, I just want to take my iPhone. I mean, we have video tools at our hands, but we never had before, and walk them through the work that we're doing right now so they can see it firsthand. And she was able to send that out, and it was so impactful. In fact, there's resources out there, and this is horrible. I apologize about how blurry this is on the left here, but this is ThankView. I don't know if anybody's familiar with ThankView. I think they're part of the Evertrue platform now. But the gentleman who started this, I had conversations with him years ago because he figured a way for us gift officers sitting at our laptops, at our desks, to be able to just take video, organic video of us looking into our cameras and saying, hey, wanted to give you an update. We're doing these 3 things. Thought you'd find it valuable, and send that out and have it very personalized to a list of people. And so I think there's really smart ways that people can do. I mean, in fact, this one on the right here, the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra, this was again during COVID, some of the creative, authentic use of video they did weren't getting butts in seats down at the Civic Center, Performing Arts Center. And so they brought the arts to their home. And it just so happened the principal cellist and the concertmaster are married, and they brought people into their home, broke down some of those barriers, the formality, used a very simple video, and were able to kind of bring that into somebody's home. Other things we're seeing from a technology standpoint, this is an example of something that UT Austin has done a couple times, is building out digital journeys. So it's not just, when we think of email, we all think, hey, this is a cheap alternative, or easy way for us to communicate with folks. But just as easy as it is to communicate, it's easy to delete. If you're like me, first thing I do in the morning is I get my phone, I go through my couple inboxes, and I just delete everything that looks like junk. So when I sit down at my desk, I have, hopefully meaningful stuff I can read through. So how do we, build automated journeys that are relevant based on how they're taking action, that we can queue it up? So it's not just the one email they get from us every 6 months, but it's something built around an action we want them to take. And so again, these are examples that I'm going to send. In particular, this next slide is just kind of a sample journey. If you're trying to, this is kind of an initial wills journey that others have used. If you're thinking about building any of these things on your own, this is just a great example. Same thing with kind of triggered email campaigns. How do we know everybody's on this call is busy, probably juggling a variety of different things. We're not going to be sitting at our desk when somebody responds to our email. So how do we, if we're sending emails out, how do we make sure we build ourselves a little runway and a little time by having emails, if we have an offer strategy or a call to action, have something triggered so it will go back to them immediately. And then as I was talking about AI, there's so many. A lot of us think of AI, we think of ChatGPT. If you haven't heard Josh Burkholz at BWF up in the Twin Cities speak, he's given a lot of great talks on the ethical use of AI and all the different ways, prospect identification, donor journey mapping, marketing automation, content. A lot of us think about that. But there's a lot of different ways that AI can play a role in our world. In fact, I mentioned earlier Cherry and Koshi here in Des Moines, him and his partner in crime, Nathan Chappelle, who's now down in the Nashville area. They've done a couple, I think 2 years now of this, where they've done surveys of donors and what are donors' perceptions of AI. And you see here on the left, 82% are familiar with AI. However, if you look on the right there, the impact of AI on donor giving and behavior, a third of those donors might hesitate to support us if we're using AI. So it's kind of this, all right, you're familiar, you know it's out there, but you don't necessarily trust us. So, what does that mean? And I'll show you a couple examples of how some folks are incorporating that. But first, this was another study that our own CGP did last spring, on our perception of AI within the nonprofits. And you're seeing, 46% are already actively using. In the next 3 to 5 years, almost three-quarters of us expect to use AI actively. I would say if you're waiting 5 years to actively use it, you're probably going to be behind the eight ball on a couple things, because this type of technology is changing so quickly. But there are smart ways to do it. A couple examples that we've seen, and this is just a little inside baseball for everybody, but we're starting to test it in our own intelligence center. This is kind of our dashboard for our clients when we have web analytics, email analytics, survey, even print analytics. We get so many great anecdotal feedbacks from surveys in particular, or even based on how people are navigating the website, how long they're spending on a site, or what they're clicking on. We're starting to beta test AI to actually give gift officers, hey, this donor has done XYZ. This would be a potential script you want to do, or this would be how you'd want to follow up, or when you'd want to follow up with them based on what AI is gathering on their activity or their digital footprint or engagement. On the right here, we're seeing AI coming in to help us with processes a lot more. So there's some great companies, Virtuous and some other companies, that have really started utilizing AI for gift officers for helping back office processes to streamline some of the paper pushing that we typically do. And then this was something, and Bob, I don't know if you were part of this, but this was part of the Leadership Institute this past fall, where they asked me to facilitate a table at CGP's Leadership Institute on virtual engagement officers using AI. So this is, if you haven't seen, this is a real thing that's already happening. There's a company, and I've been on a couple calls with them, Givesy, which is the one on the left with San Diego State University, and then Max, which is the one on the right, and that's Paul Casperson, who was at Iowa State for years and was at University of Florida for quite a few years too, and Brian Klontz. These are tools that they're putting onto people's websites or microsites behind the scenes to build relationships. Amy Walling, who's at San Diego State, was adamant when I share this to tell everybody they're not asking for gifts. They are building, they're stewarding relationships. But these are things that are out there where the one thing I really think is interesting about this, and I do appreciate, is that they're transparent. They're not saying that this guy's Sandy, and they named it Sandy for San Diego State. But they're not saying that Sandy is a real person. They are being very forthright that this is an AI interaction engagement officer. And why Amy decided to beta test this is she blatantly said, she goes, I can put 1,000 prospects into this person's file. You can load it with all the information that they know, and it's a closed AI, so it's not open AI. But they can load it with all the information they know about these folks and the things they care about as it relates to San Diego State. And this individual, through email, through text, through the interaction on the microsite, can engage with those donors at a fraction of the cost it would take for her. If at 1,000 individuals, she would have to hire 10 gift officers. So she can have this tool cultivate or steward relationships up into a point that they dictate at San Diego State. And they say, once it gets to this type of conversation or these types of questions or this type of engagement, then it kicks it over to a real life person. So again, it's an interesting thing to watch. It's very, very new. I think, it's the world we are right these days. There may be a place for it, there may not. But it's the reality of kind of how AI is moving so quickly. I even see AI note takers on here too, on the screen. So anyways, all right, I left a couple minutes, maybe. I know we kind of cruise through stuff here, but really kind of the takeaways, hopefully, you're able to glean a couple things. But the wealth transfer is very much here, and the way boomers react to this and the way they react to us is a lot different than the previous generation. So just being mindful of what we need to do to build trust with them and how we can, further build out that engagement. Thinking of the donor journey, again, Big believer, if you're on LinkedIn, follow Jen Shang, Adrian Sargent, that's her partner, Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy, because it isn't only for plan giving. We apply it to plan giving, but it can have impact in major annual giving work too to help you better connect a relationship and a values match with donors through marketing. And then figure out what works from a technological standpoint. If you guys are waiting 5 years to figure out how AI can make some of your operations more efficient, that's too long. So be mindful. But I think the biggest thing, and I'm part of the Giving Institute, which supports Giving USA, and it's been a topic in most of our meetings, our quarterly meetings the last couple of years, is when you're tackling AI, just be mindful of the donor experience. We as stewards, for profits, can easily jump into the AI bucket, and if they lose a couple consumers, so be it. Losing donors and losing donor trust is a thing that's really hard to get back. So if we are dipping our toe into AI, make sure you have an AI policy, make sure you're being forthright with folks on how you're using it and where you're using it. So I know there's a lot. I spoke really fast.